This presentation was originally given for a group of investment traders, and the idea behind the presentation was to explore what happens when a human being encounters a form of adversity, which we can describe as a risk, and how do we develop or design for ourselves a strategy of resilience. There was interesting feedback during the presentation and many interesting questions were offered. And I began to think about the presentation not just directed towards investment traders, but to think about all human beings, particularly because one of the comments after the presentation suggested that what they'd learnt from the presentation was a way of thinking about themselves as having balance. And as a lot of my work is around supporting people developing strategies for well-being, I thought it would be useful and interesting to share a version of this presentation out to everybody. It may be useful if I say just a little bit about myself. I have been described as somebody who works in change or works in change management, and I do that in three ways. I work with individuals who are experiencing a form of adversity that they realise needs to change. Either the condition needs to change or something within themselves needs to change. I also work with organisations that are experiencing a very similar thing, that they're recognising that there's a condition that is adverse to the operation of the organisation, and yet at the same time there's a recognition that something within the organisation might need to change to be able to deal with that adversity. And I do something called meta change, and meta change is where I work with individuals who work with organisations in change management, and I help them process their understanding of how the change is manifesting and what blocks or occlusions they may be encountering when they're thinking about the process of change for the organisation. I'm particularly interested in two philosophical approaches. One of them is integral theory, and I've been using integral theory for around 13 years in my work. And I'm also interested in critical realism, and for about the past 4 or 5 years I've been presenting a lot on critical realism and seeing if I can make critical realism a more popular philosophy simply because of its complexity. So we can suggest that critical realism looks at things and integral theory looks at how we see those things. The reason I'm pointing to this is because when we think about resilience, we have to think about resilience both as an experience, or how do we experience resilience, and also as a mechanism, what kind of things need to exist when we think about resilience. I'm going to look at a number of different aspects of resilience. I think it's important that we begin by speaking about what resilience is and what resilience isn't, and having a clearer idea of resilience will take us into thinking about resilience having dimensions, the sense at which we have to think about not just being resilient for ourselves but for our families and our organisations. So we'll speak a little bit about that sense of resilience, and that will then take us into 4 truths of resilience, or what I'm calling the 4 truths of real resilience. When building this presentation, I began to look at the literature on resilience, and I've been guided a lot in constructing this presentation through the use of resilience therapy. And resilience therapy, it basically has done a sweep of the literature on resilience and defined what it thinks are 4 things that are necessary when we think about resilience, and we can call those the 4 truths of resilience. So I'm going to cover a little bit about those 4 truths. I don't think you can touch on resilience without thinking about the brain, and in particular when the brain is hijacked and how the brain gets hijacked. So I'm going to do a very simple sweep through the brain, and why we might want to then think about a centering practice. And I'm going to offer you a centering practice that can help deal with that emotional hijacking that tends to happen when we suddenly find ourselves confronted with an adversity. And centering will take us into well-being and to think about some of the strategies that we need to contemplate when we're thinking about well-being. My hope is that I cover a wide enough sweep of the science of resilience, while at the same time pointing to the importance of having a resilience practice, and at the same time thinking about how resilience is an aspect of our well-being, or how do we develop resilience to develop our well-being. So let's begin then with what resilience is and what resilience is not. And I'll read the slide. Resilience does not constitute an individual trait or characteristic. Let's look at that then. If we said that resilience was a trait or a characteristic, it becomes very easy then to criticise people for not having enough resilience, for not having enough backbone, for not being strong enough. Of course, this proposes that something like post-traumatic stress disorder is not a fault of an overabundant amygdala. It's actually your fault. You just need to have enough backbone. And it makes it very difficult then to think about how can we develop resilience if we're saying that some people are resilient and some people aren't resilient. Now it may seem contrary to popular belief about resilience, particularly when we are presented with people who appear to be resilient. People that run marathons or Paralympians or soldiers that come back from war, they all have this really deep characteristic that appears to be a characteristic of resilience. And I don't want to take away from the fact that what they are strong and purposeful. But what they also have is a whole set of structures around them that are supporting them in that resilience. So it's possible then to say that resilience involves a range of processes that bring together quite diverse mechanisms. Here we're speaking of resilience in a kind of ontological sense, as opposed to a subjective experience of you and I saying that person is resilient because I experience them as resilient. We're talking about resilience ontologically. We're saying that resilience is not something that we have as a capacity, as a characteristic or a trait. Resilience is a set of mechanisms that come together to support us when we enter into a diverse condition. Now it seems to me that that's such a wide sweep away from what we normally experience as resilience, or we normally consider to be resilience, that it would be useful if I showed you a photograph. This is a photograph of an astronaut. Now, an astronaut enters into an adverse condition, and that adverse condition is so adverse that it could kill them. Now, no amount of backbone or no amount of character trait is going to support the survival of that astronaut in that adverse condition. For them to experience that adverse condition, they have to have a whole set of mechanisms around themselves. And not only do they have to have a whole set of mechanisms around themselves, but they have to ensure that they follow the procedures of those mechanisms. All those things, called the spacesuit, are multiple layers of suits, each one providing an element of resilience for the individual in that adverse condition. If the individual took one of those away, they would die. The adverse condition would overcome them, would overwhelm them. So we need to think about resilience then as both strategies and mechanisms that we can have access to in such a way as for you and I to be able to manage an adverse condition, because that adverse condition will affect our survival. It's also then important to think about an overcoming adversity, which is what we're intending to do, while also potentially or subtly changing or even dramatically transforming aspects of that adversity. What I'm not suggesting is that we become adverse. We don't avoid adversity. We don't become adverse to adversity. We don't try and run away when there's an adversity there. I'm not for a minute suggesting that we become conditioned to avoid adversity. What I'm suggesting is that we need to enter into adversity, to adverse states, to develop and grow. I think a simple example of that is to suggest that a bodybuilder goes into a gym, and we would normally say a bodybuilder goes into a gym to build muscle. But a bodybuilder doesn't go into the gym to build muscle. The bodybuilder goes into the gym to destroy muscle. The bodybuilder actually takes themselves into a condition that is adverse to them, that is detrimental to them. But because there's a whole set of structures and mechanism around themselves, or hopefully they've thought about a training plan and a diet plan and a plan of sleeping, they can then begin to build muscle, because the muscle builds because of the damages experienced in the gym. And it's the same with us. It's the same with any adverse condition. We want to enter into the adverse condition in such a way that we can transform it. It can become something that is important to us. We can take on the challenge, but have enough support. Otherwise, we potentially lose our capacity for evolution. We just become static, and we don't want to become static. What we want to do is we want to have the capacity to challenge ourselves, but to challenge ourselves in such a way that it's not detrimental to our health and our well-being. We can think then of real resilience as existing in 4 dimensions. And these 4 dimensions, we could see these 4 dimensions if we think about Wilber's integral theory. We can see resilience as a sense of, we have emotions, and those emotions can set us off into adverse conditions. The emotions can overwhelm us. And therefore, when we begin to think about resilience, we have to think about having an agility to those emotions. Again, I'm not for a minute suggesting that we avoid those emotions or we don't experience those emotions. It may be that one of the trickiest things I encounter with people is when people don't experience anger, when there's a dismissal of anger or an avoidance of anger or a turning of anger into depression. By not encountering anger, by not developing a relationship to anger, we have no idea how to manage that anger. And it's the same with any of our emotions. Our emotions are part of ourselves and in some way need to be managed, and we can only manage them when we give permission for them to be there. But of course, those emotions can create an adverse condition for us. So we need to think about, if we want to experience our emotions deeply, to become more emotional, to develop emotional agility or emotional literacy, we have to have some form of structure in place to support us when we are encountering those emotions. The same goes for the body. The person going to the gym to get fitter is only getting fitter by getting worse. They're actually putting themselves under duress. They are putting themselves under an adverse condition in the hope that the body will respond to that adverse condition in a way that makes them fitter. And that's constantly, it's almost a lifetime. I'm a UK athletics group running leader, and I know that when I go running and I want to get my heart rate up into zone 5, I know that I'm pushing myself into a potential adverse condition. So I need to think about how I take care of myself. The brain also responds to adverse conditions, and ideally we want to ensure that our brain responds to the adverse condition in a way that supports us, not cripples us. Relationships can have adversity, and therefore we have to think about resilience in terms of how do we manage an adverse condition when our relationship manifests. And the same can be said for systems. Systems themselves can have adverse conditions, and therefore we have to construct some resilience to them. The interesting thing about this, however, of course, is that, to use an integral theory term, they tetramesh. When we encounter an adverse condition in one area, it potentially shows up in all the others. So we can't really think about resilience as being something, or the strategy of resilience as being something in isolation of each dimension. We have to think about them as tetrameshing. So if I experience some powerful emotion, or if I experience powerful emotion of anger, that may come through in my body. Or if I choose not to experience a powerful emotion of anger, but still have anger, that may come through in my body. It may also show up in my relationships. And it may also show up in how I work, how I practice my work. I might both fall out with my partner and say something that I shouldn't say while with my work colleagues. And this is because I've not in some way processed my anger. But I'm sort of focusing on the emotional. We could go at any point if there's something that goes wrong at work and all of a sudden I'm in an adverse condition that I can't quite manage. I'm going to feel slightly under duress. I'm going to have these emotions and they're going to affect my body. And if my body feels affected and I'm feeling down or depressed or low energy, that's going to affect my relationship. So we need to think about resilience also as a dimensional affair, that to think about resilience in one dimension means that we're thinking about how we're resilient in all 4 dimensions. An easy way of looking at this is to think about resilience as psychological resilience, biological resilience, and social resilience. And within social resilience, we can separate that out into resilience of the culture and resilience of the system. So it's useful then to think, okay, so we know what resilience is now. It's a set of diverse mechanisms. We know that what we want to do is we want to encounter adversity because the possibility of change that adversity can help us transform. That's an evolutionary process. We want to encounter that and ensure that we have space for that. And we're also aware that resilience has this dimensional quality to it. We may now want to begin to think about 4 truths or 4 ways in which we can begin to develop strategies for resilience. And these 4 truths are accepting, commitment, conserving, and enlisting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present a slide and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these truths. What's useful as you look at the slides and listen to me speaking is to think about what are the kind of things that you might need to accept when we start thinking about strategy of resilience, and what are the things that you might want to think about conserving when we think about resilience, and what are your commitments to ensure well-being, and who do you enlist. So it's to begin to think about how might you take these 4 truths and apply them to your life.